Your greenhouse is the most precious real estate on your whole farm.
All right, folks, we're back with Andrew Mefferd, Carl Binger, sweet Randy Cummings, and today we're going to talk about the Greenhouse and Hoop House Growers Handbook. It's been out for a while. I failed to recognize how long it's been since it came out.
Yeah, it's been 7 or 8 years.
Congratulations on that accomplishment you had back in the day. And
Thank you.
Yeah, it is a great book. So I would like to hear the origin story of the inspiration for the writing of it.
Yeah, good question. First of all, thanks for having me here. It's been a pleasure. It is a pleasure.
Thanks for making the flight and the drive and the crazy drive.
Yeah, well, like I keep saying, it's been about a decade that I've been saying that I'm going to come down here to Paris and see you, and I finally did. So thanks for having me. It's fun. You've got a great setup here. It's been fun. So really, the inspiration for the book came from my own experiences. I learned how to farm by working on farms. In fact, my wife, Annie, calls it doing the apprentice circuit. I met my wife on a farm in Pennsylvania, and from there we went out and worked on a farm in California, worked up in Washington State for a season, and then we headed back east and worked at the research farm for Virginia Tech for a season. Then we started a farm. First farm location didn't work out. Hit the road again and apprenticed up in New York State, and then one last apprenticeship in Maine, which is what brought us to our current location in Maine. What I noticed is that almost all the farms that we worked for had a hoop house, but most of those farms really treated the hoop house like an extension of the field, as far as they used the same spacing as they did out in the field. They used the same varieties as out in the field. They did the same fertility as out in the field. They weren't really doing anything different. It really wasn't until I started working at Johnny's, because just serendipitously, the farm that we ended up settling down on, where we still are in central Maine, is only about 35 minutes away from the Johnny's research farm. Two things happened. I have a tomato obsession. It's my favorite crop to grow. We went from starting our farm in Pennsylvania, which is a great field tomato state, right? You can plant early enough and harvest a long season of great tasting field tomatoes, up to Maine, which is not known as a good field tomato area, right? And so I moved from one area where we could grow great field tomatoes to another area where it's really not commercially viable. Technically, you can ripen a tomato outdoors in Maine, but the season is so short, I would really only recommend it to gardeners. By the time you start getting ripe tomatoes in August, nighttime temperatures are starting to really drop quickly again.
And you're thinking about a crop that you have so much on the front end as far as labor and time that unless you're going to pull that full yield out of that plant's potential, it's kind of a waste.
Exactly. There's too much investment. That's the advice that I would give anybody around us in Maine that I do. And that's also the trend that I've seen is most of the commercial growers in our area do not grow tomatoes in the field anymore. Maybe cherry or grape tomatoes, because they ripen so much earlier, probably make a profit on cherry or grape tomatoes in the field in Maine. As far as large fruited tomatoes, heirlooms and things like that, you're not going to make any money. It's not commercially viable in my opinion. The other thing that happened is that almost as soon as we moved to Maine, I got a job working for Johnny's, and I ended up working there for the next 7 years. Most of that time spent in the research department doing trials on tomatoes and other crops too. But I think most farmers and gardeners deep down inside want to plant one of everything in the catalog. And that was basically my job. Because that's how we did the trials, right? Is it was basically my job to plant one of everything that was in the catalog, all of the new varieties that other companies, people had developed that were maybe the competing varieties, right? Because every single variety looks great in the seed catalog. It's not until you plant it out and grow it and trial it that you can really see how the varieties stack up. And so that's what I would do. I would put all the cherry tomatoes that Johnny's was carrying in a row. And then I would put the similar varieties, like all the new red cherry tomatoes next to the Johnny's cherry tomatoes, new yellow cherry tomatoes next to the yellow cherry tomatoes that we are currently carrying, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there were a lot of et ceteras. I mean, I think I had tomato trials that were over 300 varieties. Just on the field side, and then greenhouse tomato trials with 30 or 50 more varieties. So yeah, that was a dream job, and it let me scratch that itch of just like wanting to see everything in the seed catalog. The longer I was there, I got more and more specialized on greenhouse varieties is where my interest was, and there was a huge growth in greenhouse growing at that time. Part of what was going on is the NRCS was doing its high tunnel program. People were getting high tunnels funded by the NRCS's Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, and so that's still a great program. If people are listening to this and want a high tunnel for their farm, it applies to commercial farmers. I think most, if not all, states participate in this program, where growers who need them can apply and may be able to get the cost of a tunnel covered. So there was this huge growth of greenhouse growing. I was able, through the job, to visit with a lot of university researchers, large commercial growers, greenhouse growers, the kind that I had never been exposed to. And it made me realize that there's this whole other set of growing practices that is very greenhouse specific.
And that's one of the things I really liked about the book is you talking about going to these other places, plus showing the pictures. I liken that to kind of what Bootstrap does in that we are primarily here to service market gardeners, but we also have equipment that gardeners can buy, and now it's an heirloom piece of farm gardening equipment that's going to last them a lifetime because we're taking that same commercial application and dialing it down to the scale at which a new market gardener is starting, which a home gardener is starting, and they can use the efficiencies of a commercial grower to at least start and then scale up. So I like the fact that in the book you gave picture examples and you went to those places and kind of scaled it down to even your operation, which is where a lot of people want to be.
And I mean, that's a really good point, is if you buy a greenhouse frame and take care of it, it can last for decades. I mean, our frames are at least 12 years old now, and the frames are in great shape. We obviously have to replace the plastic and the wood from time to time.
And that's great shape in Maine, which is prone to a lot of snow and a lot of extra forces a lot of people aren't going to have. So it's a good lesson.
Right. Probably less ultraviolet degradation on the plastic than most locations, but maybe more snow load in other forces, which actually is an interesting thing, right? Because you sell the greenhouse kits that have all metal on the ends.
Right.
And that's a really nice thing. So our farm is still certified organic. And so we can't use treated wood. And nor would I want to. I do not know what's in the treatment, right? And if you think that you're going to be sinking that wood into the soil that your plants are growing in, I can't. I'm not sure what's in it, but I wouldn't really want to take a chance. So the situation that organic growers find themselves in is you can't use treated wood, and so that wood that's in contact with the ground, it rots at a certain point. So I know, that's one really cool thing about your frames is that they come with the metal end walls. And so it's like, they're not going to rot and you're not going to have to replace the wood. I realized that there was a whole other set of practices for growing in greenhouse that was really different than all the experience that I had gained working on farms in all those states. What I noticed is that the growers that were using them were getting much higher yields and controlling disease better without chemicals, controlling disease through climate and things like that. They were just having a lot more success than we were in our smaller hoop houses. And at the time, they were also unheated. So I would say I learned a lot from growers who had much bigger greenhouses and what I would say high-tech greenhouses. They had heating, they had fans, they had ventilation, they had more high-tech climate controls than I did. And so one of my questions became, well, how much of this can I achieve in a more low-tech situation like I had at home at the time? And so I just started trying out these techniques that I'd learned from these bigger growers who are mostly really sharing. I have to give a lot of credit to the people who taught me. Most of them were very sharing, and I learned a lot from them. But then I had to go and try it out. And what I found was that most of the techniques that the growers were using in the bigger, more high-tech houses still worked and still applied. All right, to give you an example, we have some 30 by 48 hoop houses. We have a variety of different sizes on my farm, but one of the main sizes that we have is 30 foot wide by 48 feet long. We would get about a ton of tomatoes out of a house like that over the course of a season. By the time we made all the changes that I talk about in the book, we had doubled that yield. We went from getting 1 ton to 2 tons out of a house. And that's not even the limit. There's other things that we could do. I'm not saying that's a ceiling. I'm saying, like, if people do all these things, they can even do better than that.
Well, that's why I want to have these focus podcasts, is because if we just teach somebody a little bit every single time they listen, and you alluded to this in the Michael Bell podcast, is that just making small changes over the last couple of years, you've doubled your yield under the same amount of square footage. And then you've doubled your square footage on top of that through natural growth, which means that force multiplier just really went off the deep end.
Could you say it again how much? Because you kind of made I heard the number, but I wasn't. You said about a ton of tomatoes off of how much space?
30 foot wide by 48 foot long hoop house. So unheated hoop house in Maine.
Wow.
And that's, that's not even sky's the limit. I'm not saying like that's the number you should be shooting for. To give you an example, that amount of yield was typically a hoop house that we would plant half to greenhouse varieties and half to heirlooms. And, wow. they're all grafted. So that's something we can get to today. Let's talk about grafting. Grafting is definitely one of the things that will increase the yield a lot.
For that. Yeah.
Heirlooms definitely brought the yield down, okay? Because In the first place, they're just not as high yielding. They're not just selected over time. They weren't bred for yield. And so and the second part about the heirlooms is without any real disease resistance, they would always die before the greenhouse varieties. And in fact, my greenhouse varieties would usually make it until they got killed by cold. Mm-hmm. And what would usually take out my heirlooms is leaf mold. Okay, and so those are two strikes sort of against the heirloom varieties. So if all I cared about was yield, I would plant a solid hoop house full of greenhouse varieties, and I'd probably get even more than 2 tons. I like growing some heirlooms. We had market customers who I knew came to us specifically for heirlooms. It's like, it's not all about yield, I guess we can say. Or it's up to every grower. The big greenhouses where yield is the main thing, their tunnels are full of greenhouse varieties. But like, that's an example of something else I could do even more if I were only focused on yield. I could forget about the heirlooms and just do greenhouse varieties. But that's an example of something that didn't completely maximize our yield. We charged more for the heirlooms. I don't think we could charge as much as it would.
I want to pick your brain a little bit, Andrew, about, we talk about the myths of what a greenhouse tomato is and why some growers gravitate towards heirlooms in the first place. When it comes to, let's say, flavor, in your opinion, looking at all these tomato varieties over the years, is there big taste difference? Is there a big texture difference? What are growers looking for when they're looking? You mentioned leaf mold resistance. What other factors are you specifically looking for in a good greenhouse tomato, and how do you think that chalks up kind of flavor-wise?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. A big part of that answer is that, particularly when I was doing the trials for Johnny's, I was looking for really good tasting varieties out of a subset that's not known for great taste. Okay, so there definitely are some good tasting greenhouse varieties out there, and that's what I was trying to find. People may know, or they may not know, that greenhouse varieties and sort of like high production varieties, even for the field, are bred for so many things other than flavor. The way I think of it, every vegetable variety is a compromise between multiple different factors. Like the things that we would evaluate a tomato on would be flavor, would be appearance, and in some ways is like, does it fit the criteria of what your customers want in the realm of market farmers, right? Like, if you have a market for beef steaks, and a variety is a little like 2-ounce saladette tomato, your customers are probably not going to buy it. Of course, we want good vigor because we want it to grow fast. And also vigor is something that when plants hit setbacks, stress like weather, pest, or disease pressure, it's essentially, if a plant is strong, it's better at overcoming stresses than if it's weak. Obviously, ideally, our tomatoes would taste great and yield really well and have a wide variety of disease resistances, I would say, that are common to the greenhouse. Because it's important to note that it's not so much that there are no pests or diseases in a greenhouse, it's just there's different pests and diseases than are out in the field. So to my mind, leaf mold is a poster child for greenhouse diseases on tomatoes, because it seems like most people who build a hoop house, they'll have a honeymoon of 2 or 3 years before leaf mold will show up. And I don't even know where it comes from, because leaf mold is a spore-based fungal disease almost never see in field tomatoes, but it flourishes under hot, humid conditions.
So like we know plant disease, right, needs a few things. It needs a host, it needs to be present to begin with, and it needs that perfect environment. And if a hoop house is humid, has a food source, all these tomato plants, and it's warm, it's going to be pretty happy, right? I think there's this misconception about greenhouse tomatoes, and I think if we open that up, I think anytime you and I have discussed flavor and varieties for market gardeners and stuff like that, it's always been around, I think the bigger thing is shippability, right? Mm-hmm. Like tomato that's shippable, and by that I mean put in a case, stacked on a pallet, put on a freight truck, driven halfway across the country, and survived that journey being picked up by 4 different customers in the grocery store. That's a tomato that's probably not going to have... You've sacrificed a lot in the flavor department to get that shippability. But the same could be true of melons. Any other storage carrot might not have the same flavor profile as a fresh market carrot, right? So I don't want to blame the greenhouse side of that. I think it's more of, was this variety when it was bred had that shippability in mind as a chase characteristic versus that heirloom that was never intended to be a shipping tomato, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, exactly. I think that the heirlooms were picked, just selected over generations by people based on what they like to eat, right?
Mm-hmm.
Flavor. They also tended to be soft, which I think is something that people may not realize contributes to flavor. People like that soft kind of like melting quality of heirlooms, and also they tend to have thin skins. The softness and the thin skins are the opposite of what they breed for.
Mm-hmm.
For shippability and in shelf life and things like that. And so I think that a lot of that is why grocery store tomatoes, people will use that term grocery store tomato to basically mean a tomato that isn't very good tasting. So many of the greenhouse varieties are not the greatest tasting ones. So that's a funny thing I can say from all of my years of tomato tasting. It's like I've tasted a lot of bad tomatoes over the years. It took going through a lot of bad ones to find the best ones. Johnny's being a company that caters to market farmers. I mean, market farmers get paid by yield, get paid by the pound like everybody else, but nobody's going to come to your stand for having the highest yield. The thing that's going to keep somebody coming back to your stand is having the best tasting tomato. Right. So once again, I guess if you want to view all tomato varieties as a compromise, we want to find the ones that compromise in favor of flavor and texture and things like that, instead of with thick skins that's been picked for shelf life over flavor. So whatever it is, I mean, I tasted everything, that's so that was just, I guess it's hard to say exactly what the ratio was, but I just let the flavor tell me. And I did look at yield and things like that. I mean, I realized something still has to be in the acceptable ballpark.
Yeah.
But I was trying to pick tomatoes that had good disease resistance and yield, but also had pretty good flavor.
And I think yield, when we're talking about yield, we have to be very careful that we're looking at marketable yield, right? So this plant might produce the same weight of fruit as this plant of a different variety, but if the splitting and cracking and rotting and blemishes put that into a category where it's no longer marketable, or you bring it to market and you're bringing it back with you at the end of the day, like we got to deduct some points off that yield, right? Because we're not in the same ballpark.
We also got to keep in mind different strokes for different folks, right?
Sure.
It's like I do tend to like the heirlooms. I tend to like very soft, high sugar, high acid flavor profile. We have to remember it is, and I guess I'm talking to the market farmers here, if you are selling something to other people, you can't completely rely on your own taste. So there's a couple, just from interacting with the public at farmers markets, got a couple things to pass along here. Particularly early in our farming career, we were very into heirlooms. And I remember one time, setting up at a farmers market and probably mostly had, unusual colors, pinks, bicolors, purples, yellows, stuff like that. And I remember one customer being like, "Don't you just have some normal tomatoes?"
Right.
I think what they meant by that was like a red, round,
big
fairly
red
firm.
fat one.
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly. And so, whatever my preferences would be, not everybody is the same way. Like another thing, like I find so one correlation is that the lighter colored tomatoes, like the yellow ones, tend to be lower in acid, which I find kind of bland and boring. But there's also some people out there that have like acid reflux,
Right.
or just like or like maybe they're super tasters or whatever, that don't like highly acidic foods and find those tomatoes too strong. And so I guess, and I've also had customers say, "I like a nice firm tomato."
Sure.
So I guess those kind of people might like, like a good greenhouse, might really like a good greenhouse tomato, like a big greenhouse beefsteak that has some firmness, which is true. Like if you're making a BLT, or like there's some things, or like if you're dicing it up for salsa, where it's kind of nice if the tomato has a little structure. So I guess I would, that's why, like I was saying, in our hoop house, we grew some heirlooms. We grew what I consider to be the best tasting of the greenhouse tomatoes. Especially if you're selling to the public, it's a matter of having a variety. And I guess if you're just growing for yourself, you can grow whatever you like.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of memories that I have kind of, related to taste and flavor in tomatoes. And I know, like, when we were doing massive variety trials, it may come down to these tomatoes are top contenders and they have similar yields, similar disease resistance, and we know we're going to move forward with one of these 5. Hey team, which one do you like best? And we would do a group taste testing with 30 people amongst the research department, the sales department, maybe a couple people from marketing, right? And while you're chasing flavor, flavor is different for every person. And no matter what, I would find usually the group is split.
Yes.
And so that tells you it's hard to select for flavor when everybody's preference is different. And I know I remember a story of Sace came to visit, right? And they've got pretty nice tomato breeding program and basil program and things like that. We were talking to them about tomatoes. What trends are there? Is it sour? Is it sweet? Is it tangy? Is it meaty? They were telling a story about how in Italy, you're eating a tomato with every single meal, right? So you need, an acidic tomato. You need a sweet tomato. You need, a slicer and a sauce tomato and so on and so forth, because the application is so different, when you're eating a tomato with every single meal, whether it's a cherry or a grape or a beefsteak or whatnot. And that always kind of stuck with me. But I know if you go to market and there are 5 vendors with tomatoes, I don't care if it's carrots or potatoes or what have you, it's nice to have that differentiator at your stall, right? If you're the only person with a purple tomato or the only person with a purple carrot or a red potato or whatever, that's going to increase that likelihood that someone's going to stop and ask you about that purple tomato or that yellow tomato. They might not buy it, but it might initiate a conversation, and then they'll buy your red tomatoes while they're standing in your booth as opposed to someone else's booth. And I think that's it's good to have that assortment. But we talked a little bit about variety selection and that leaf mold and whatnot. I think it's important for anyone that's considering buying a hoop house, and you talk about it in the book, and I think you did a kind of a fantastic job, laying out a series of crops that from an agronomic and economic scale do well at their spacing in that environment. I'd like to unpack that a little bit because, you talk about tomatoes, you talk about cucumbers, peppers, eggplants, those solanaceous crops, along with cugs, lettuce being the primary kind of money makers for the farm. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of agronomic scale and why those crops as opposed to other pet favorites? Carl may love watermelon, but that doesn't mean watermelon's the best choice to plant in the hoop house, right?
Yeah. Watermelon takes up kind of a lot of space, a lot of precious real estate. So, yeah. I mean, that's a really good point. The book focuses on 8 crops, and that's like really, that's really where you should start, especially if you're trying to run a market farm and pay for that space. And so, really, what I noticed was that almost all the big commercial greenhouses that I went into were growing those 8 crops, like almost exclusively. It's fruiting crops and leafy crops. And so on the fruiting side, we've got tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, and cucumbers. And on the leafy side, you've got lettuce and other mixed greens, like various, cut and come again salad greens. There's herbs, most notably basil, partially because basil is the most popular herb in North America. And then microgreens, right? So there's there's this group of fruiting crops and there's this group of 4 leafy crops that almost are like, if you look at big commercial greenhouses, that's the bulk of commercial greenhouse production. And so, I was also used to greenhouses that were growing a little bit of everything. And so it made me think, why? Like, these guys must know something, if they're almost exclusively focusing on these crops. I realized that there's a few reasons to grow these crops. And for one thing, they're perishable, right? So you need to be constantly growing a fresh supply of them, right? You can't fill up a cellar full of tomatoes and sell them out over the next 6 months, right? So same thing with greens. The greens are even more obvious. They're so perishable, right? So they're perishable. There's year-round demand, right? People want a nice salad all year round.
It's on every menu at every restaurant. There's a salad, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about how much salad mix is consumed in the country, it's tons every day, and so there's a market there. And another thing is that those crops are just fetch a high enough price per pound to pay back, right? Because, I think this point actually is relevant whether you're a market farmer and trying to support a business, or even this really applies to homesteaders too. Because the thing is, your greenhouse is the most precious real estate on your whole farm, right? Because you invested money in the frame, in the plastic, and in all the other components that go into it. And you either invested money or your own sweat equity to actually build the darn thing, right? So the greenhouse space is the most expensive space to build and maintain on the whole farm. And so it has to return at a whole higher level. And so you need crops. So that's the other thing, is all 8 of those crops fetch a high enough price per pound to actually give you a profit. And you know what, even if you're doing this to feed your family or your family and neighbors or something like that, you still want to get the biggest yield out of that space that you worked and paid so hard to prepare. And so the last thing about all those crops is that they tend to fit into two cropping cycles, either one extremely long cropping cycle, right? Like with enough heat, I mean, there are big greenhouse growers here in North America that will plant a tomato crop in January and take it all the way around to the following December, right? So, you could have an 11-month tomato crop. I don't know very many direct market farmers or smaller farmers that are doing that, but I mean, it's not theory. A lot of greenhouses in North America will grow a tomato crop for 11 or even 12 months. When you consider that if they put the crop in January, that means that the seed was started in December, so that the plants might actually be a year old or close to a year old by the time they come out, right? And so the whole idea is that, tomatoes, you have a lot of labor on the front end. You've bought the seed, you've propagated it, perhaps you've grafted it. So what's the days to maturity on a large fruited tomato? Like 60 or 70 days. So it's after you've already done all the propagation work, it's going to take almost 2 months growing in your greenhouse in the coldest time of year, which, if you're really stretching out the season, you're paying for that time, right? So you got a lot invested on the front end on that crop. But if you can harvest it for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 months on the back end, that's what makes that investment upfront possible. And so the cropping cycles of most of those other crops aren't quite as long. Like cucumbers tend to be more like 2 to 4 crops a year if people are really trying to cover most of the 12 months of the year. Peppers and the eggplant are similar. So we have these 2 different cycles that tend to pay back in a greenhouse. The long cycle, like all those vining fruiting crops, or the short cycle, right? And that's where you see the short cycle come in on the leafy crops, right? Because microgreens would be an extreme example of that, right? I don't know, Randy. I mean, what's the turnaround time on a microgreen? A month or less?
We do 2 weeks on ours.
Yeah, it depends. A pea shoot might be 7, 8, maybe 9 days. Something like red vein sorrel might be 30 days or 40 days.
Cilantro is long, but most of the common stuff, like what we do, it's every 2 weeks we're harvesting.
Yeah.
So, give or take a couple days, but
yeah. So if you combine, let's say every 2 weeks times, however many months you either have the natural heat on an unheated greenhouse or, have heat if you're heating a greenhouse, do that over and over and over again. You're getting a payout every 2 weeks. That doing that over and over again is what can lead to really good profitability on things like microgreens. The turnover isn't quite as fast on lettuce, but maybe you can harvest a crop of lettuce every month, and similar time frame. I mean, the exact like days to maturity or days to harvest is gonna It's going to depend on the variety that you're growing, how much you're heating it, how much natural light and warmth there. There's a lot of factors. I don't want people to get too hung up on exactly what the time frame is, but they get it. If
Sure.
in a warm part of the country, or if you're heating a greenhouse a lot in a cold part of the country, you can get 10 or more harvests of a lettuce or any of those greens.
I think just not to get bogged down crazily in the math, but in your book you talk about pruning to single liter or double liter with tomatoes. And I remember, I think it was it 30 pounds per liter or 30 pounds per plant that you were maybe talking about in the book. But you had the math figured out that one plant was the equivalent of X dollars, right? And that's on a 12-inch spacing per liter. Mm-hmm. So when we start unpacking the math, and I think this is so critical for someone that is interested in a hoop house. I've talked to customers on the phone who are super excited about buying a hoop house because they want to put it over their raspberry bushes, or they want to grow fruit trees, or growers that they love the idea of a wooden raised bed, and they love the idea of a hoop house, and they want to put a wooden raised bed inside their hoop house. These are all things that can be done. I never want to tell someone that they're doing it wrong, or you can grow anything you want. You can, with enough energy and resources, you can grow any plant. When you can get 30 pounds of tomato potentially off a liter in a 2 square foot spacing over 6 months, or in that same footprint, you can plant one broccoli plant and harvest one head of broccoli and get $2.50 for it, or 30 pounds of tomatoes at $2.50 a pound, or whatever the math is, there's a pretty strong indication on maybe what direction you should go. And again, there are homesteaders out there, home gardeners. We're still, at the end of the day, even talking putting cans of food on your shelf, feeding your neighbors or bringing them to church or whatever. There's a lot more food, That raspberry bush, man, those are some expensive raspberries in that high tunnel.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in the book, I talk a little bit also about how to evaluate other crops. Because, so maybe for whatever reason, maybe the market's saturated, maybe people don't like tomatoes or whatever. Yeah, like winter squash or watermelons would be kind of like my poster child of what not to grow in a greenhouse. A, the plants are huge. They take up a lot of space. B, they can be stored, right? So it's like, why would you devote greenhouse space to something that grows perfectly well out in the field when you could just grow more of it in the field and store it if you needed more winter squash? Mm-hmm. C, it's not particularly high price per pound, so probably not the best thing to make your money back. And D, the market for winter squash is seasonal. People don't want to see winter squash until fall.
Sure.
Right? Grow really early varieties and put them out on your market table, but my experience is people are not excited about winter squash in the summer. So what would be the point? If people are sitting out there and thinking like, well, I don't want to grow any of your 8 crops for whatever reason, you could evaluate other things. Like I don't know, like maybe radishes, Radishes, not super high value. On the other hand, it's a really quick crop.
Right. Sure.
Yeah, if you had a good market for radishes, you could do a lot of cycles of radishes. Radishes might make sense. So I don't want to pigeonhole people too much, and when those are their criteria. So like based on just my experience, that's what most of the greenhouse space in North America is making its money on. But if you really have something else, that would just be a little test as to evaluate other crops against those 4 criteria and decide whether it makes sense to use your precious real estate for such.
I'll make one quick point, and that radishes example is a good example, but I'd take it one more step further too in saying how fragile is that crop in an unprotected environment. Radish is 28 days. Maybe you might see some flea beetle, damage on the greens. That still makes that radish root perfectly marketable, editable. That white fly damage to your tomato crop is a different story. Late blight's a different story. So that quick turn crop, that's a lot less environmental pressure it's going to need to be exposed to that you're trying to protect.
I mean, this is my favorite thing about the book is the focus on these 8 crops: the tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, cucumbers, leafy greens, lettuce, microgreens, herbs. And so when people are coming to us and be like, because we get the question, where do I even start? It's like that, like those 8 guaranteed to sell. They're at the market, and you don't have to do all 8, mind you. But if you just start there, if we're talking about these crop evaluations and what we're going to do on the outside of the tunnel and what our options are, that to me focuses where to even begin. Tomatoes, are we going to use this tunnel for a long crop, or are we going to do quick turns on succession plantings of lettuce? It takes radishes out of the equation because it's such a low value crop. I remember, and I'm going to liken hydroponic production, because we're dealing with the amount of holes that you have in production and indoor grow, to the hoop house. I was teaching a conference on hydro, and this guy was there specifically because he wanted to grow craft. We were going to go craft radishes. And he was just sold on hydro. And he showed me pictures of the radishes, and of course they were perfect, but if we're looking at a hole of production on a head of lettuce, you could get anywhere from $3 to $5 depending on how you sell it, versus radishes, which one radish in one hole is going to be 30 cents tops. And when I explained that in the 2 minutes it took to explain it, it's like I crushed his dreams. And I hated doing that, but I mean, why invest so much time, effort, energy, labor, and can you even sell it for something that, I mean, I've never got that excited about it. I know it's one of your favorites, but I mean, would you pay 10 times market value?
They better be some banging radishes, right? Yeah. And so for anybody listening to the podcast, the previous podcast we did with Andrew, he talked about starting his farm and kind of over diversifying. And at some point he had to make the judgment call that sheep weren't for him. And I think someone in their first year with the hoop house might be super excited for those radishes. But if they are selling them at market, or they are stockpiling food for their family, they're going to quickly find that maybe that radish wasn't the way to go. Again, can absolutely do it.
That's one of the best examples of opportunity cost that I can think of. So, opportunity cost I think of as, if we can't do everything in life, if you're doing one thing, it means you don't have the opportunity to do the other thing, right? So because I was standing out in a field moving sheep, I was not up the hill taking care of my greenhouse plants. If you are growing radishes, it means you are not growing tomatoes or lettuce or something else more productive or remunerative, whatever the case may be in that space. And so, yeah, you got to think about there's limited space for this stuff. And one thing we kind of talked about a little bit with the varieties, but I want to make sure and talk about the value of trying greenhouse varieties, because I remember when I first worked at Johnny's, they had this big free seed bin at Johnny's. And so, I would go, it was like seed that had passed the expiration date, or for whatever reason, wasn't saleable anymore. Everybody there farmed or gardened. And so they would throw it in this big bin. And so I remember when I first worked at Johnny's, finding some of the expensive tomato seed, finding greenhouse tomatoes back in the bin and being like, whoo, I scored some of the expensive tomato seed. I don't even know what makes it expensive, but I got it. And the next few years would just be an education in why that seed is so expensive. In fact, this came up, right before I was here. I was at a conference in Utah and did a greenhouse presentation. And one of my points is that it's really worth trying greenhouse varieties because they have special adaptations to thrive in greenhouses. Now, the big reason why I think a lot of people wouldn't try the greenhouse varieties is because they're much more expensive. Okay, so I can see why growers would be put off. So maybe a field tomato seed is, I don't know, a nickel. Let's say a field tomatoes seed is a nickel and a greenhouse tomato seed is a quarter. The difference might be bigger than that. Whatever. Greenhouse seed it tends to be on a whole order of magnitude more expensive than than field tomato seed. But there are some really important adaptations that those greenhouse varieties tend to have. So probably the biggest one that I can think of is disease resistance. And so going back to leaf mold is like the poster child for tomato diseases.
I call it like an insurance policy. So that, 25 cents, call it $1 a seed. What's the what would you pay as a farmer for an insurance policy for your tomato crop that you need to nurse through the whole season to not succumb to disease?
Well, absolutely. And I don't work for a seed company anymore. I don't have anything in this.
Yep.
Is if you get one more tomato off of a plant, that's paid for the difference in price between a greenhouse variety and a field tomato, and every other tomato after that is just gravy. It's just extra profit on top of that. And so like the example I was talking about earlier about how I would plant a hoop house that was 50-50 heirlooms and greenhouse varieties. And the heirlooms, after we'd had our hoop house for a few years, they would always get leaf mold because leaf mold is spore-based disease. And once you have it, it's very difficult to get rid of it. Even if you try washing out your greenhouse and everything, it's basically once you have leaf mold, you've got it forever.
Sure.
And it's a perfect resistance. And what I mean by that is that so far, I mean, leaf mold is probably out there mutating, trying to overcome the resistance that breeders have found naturally in populations in the wild. What breeders did is they found varieties that were resistant to leaf mold and bred them into hopefully good tasting varieties to make the greenhouse varieties of today. So, what would happen is that at some point, so leaf mold is a disease that loves heat and humidity. So at some point in the season, our heirloom varieties would get leaf mold, which is this thing if you have tomatoes and it's on the underside of the leaf, it's this kind of like fuzzy olive, dark brownish green looking stuff. And so what would happen is we would get in late in the summer, we would start seeing these spots on the undersides of the leaves, which gradually just completely take out the leaves of the plant. So, if you think about the leaves of the plant or its solar panel, well, when it's covered with spores, it's basically eating the plant. And so the solar panels aren't really working anymore. And so I would be in a greenhouse with heirlooms that are completely covered and dying of leaf mold, right? Production's going down. The solar panels aren't really working anymore. And the greenhouse varieties right next to them are completely clean. So that's what I mean by a perfect resistance at this point. The varieties that are resistant to leaf mold tend to not get it at all, right? So there's spores blowing around in there, and the greenhouse varieties are completely clean, and they go on to survive until the frost kills them in my area, right? And so you might say, why would I plant a tomato seed that's 5 times as expensive or something like that? It's because it's going to survive to the end of the season. You're going to pick so many more tomatoes off. In the grand scheme of things, seed is actually not a huge cost. You're going to pay more for a lot of the other inputs, especially labor on farms than seed. And so I think it tends to be a bad compromise to try and save a little bit of money at the beginning of the season when you then are probably going to lose money with crops going down at the end. And it applies to leafy crops too. Leaf mold is the poster child in tomatoes. I would say downy mildew would be like the poster child in leafy crops. Yeah, in fact, if you look in a lot of green catalogs, seed catalogs, the thing that will differentiate like the greenhouse lettuce mix or the greenhouse lettuce varieties is having resistance to downy mildew because it's the disease of heat and humidity in lettuce. And so, if you grow, it's an insurance policy. If you grow, you're likely to get these diseases sooner or later if you grow in a greenhouse. And so not only the disease resistance, but another thing that a lot of the greenhouse varieties are bred is fairly compact. Because you're trying to, greenhouse space is limited. You're trying to cram as many plants as possible into a given space, which can also make disease a little bit worse because more plants equals less airflow. You're going to get these diseases sooner or later. It's worth spending the money. I'd say at the very least, it's worth trialing them. Buying a packet of it or whatever, a small size that's meaningful to you. If you're hesitant about shelling out for those expensive varieties, put in a little bit, and I bet you'll see that it pays back. And because I feel like one of the, if I had to give the elevator speech on this book, of what one of the bedrock principles of greenhouse growing is, it's cramming as many plants as you possibly can into the greenhouse space. And so that's where having compact plants that have bred to be what we call small framed but dense is important. So like on lettuce and the leafy crops, for example, like there's an old variety, black-seeded Simpson, that's like been around forever. And I use that as a prime example of a really field variety, because black-seeded Simpson can get really big and really be a really heavy head of lettuce, but it's very loose, takes up a lot of space. Whereas I feel like most greenhouse varieties are bred to be compact and dense. So maybe you get the same weight as a big old black-seeded Simpson head of lettuce, but crammed into 2/3 of the space or something like that. Because and that's where my elevator speech comes in. Like, I feel like if I ran into somebody at a conference, we're in the elevator, right? And they're like, "Oh, you're about to give a greenhouse talk, but I can't come to it. I'm going to something else." What would you have told me? I would tell that person, find ways to cram more plants into that space, right? Because it's your most precious real estate. Getting more plants in there is one of the most obvious ways that you can get more out of your greenhouse. And there's some very specific tactics. So on the vining fruiting crops, migrating to a double row system instead of a single row is a way. I mean, we doubled the number of plants that we had in our hoop house on the way to doubling our yield, right? Because when we started out, we planted just like most field growers do, with a single row of plants. We would do like a single row of tomatoes with a stem every foot or so. What I noticed from visiting all these big greenhouse growers is all their vining fruiting crops, they were doing double rows. Because the system they typically use is they'll have a bed that's 3 foot wide, and then they'll put a double row of plants on that bed, and then they'll have a pathway that's 2 feet wide. I mean, that's pretty universal. People can tweak that spacing if they want, but I came to that spacing, and I didn't invent that. That's from seeing it over and over and over. And also, it's pretty flexible. You can plant, tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, eggplant in that 3 foot wide bed, 2 foot pathway, double row spacing. Because when you put 2 rows in a bed, you just decrease the amount of greenhouse space that's devoted to pathways versus growing bed space, right? And so on the green side of thing, you can just try and tighten up your spacing, and part of that is growing more compact varieties, right? Is adjusting also. So you would certainly use a more dense spacing in the summertime. If you are growing through the winter or in the fall when there's less light, you would probably want to open that spacing back out again. But that's why, like, if you look at the greenhouse lettuce varieties, they tend to be smaller, or even those mini heads can actually, it can pay off. Even if you take a slightly lower price for growing a mini or sort of like a midi head, there's in lettuce, there's anything down from like kind of like a little gem size, that's really small. And then there's medium-sized heads. So it's a numbers game where even if you grow a bed full of I'll call them midi head lettuces, there's somewhere not as small as a little gem, teeny little lettuce head, not as big as a full-size lettuce. Even if you have to charge slightly less per piece on those midi heads of lettuce, but if you can get so many more of them onto your bed, you can still make more money. Those are the main factors why growers should really trial. Don't take it from me. Try all this stuff. Like, that's what I always tell growers is, like, never switch over, whether it be something I'm recommending them to do or like a new hot variety in the catalog. Never switch like all of your production from a tried and tested variety to like the new hot thing in 1 year, in case it ends up not being the new hot thing for you. But it's really worth it for growers to try the greenhouse variety, even if they're more expensive by the seed, because it's insurance, and they'll probably survive longer and end up making more money, even though they had to spend a little bit more money up front to get those varieties.
And to hammer at home, like, if the cliff notes are cram as many plants as you can, the bullet point below that, I think, goes back to that disease resistance, right? So we've got more plant mass, and we've got less airflow because we're cramming them in tight, right? So it's that kind of two-step. Cram them in, get that optimal spacing, but make sure that variety can withstand being crammed in because it can fight off X, Y, or disease in that really, tight spacing with. I had an interesting conversation with a grower one time that switched from heirloom tomatoes in their hoop house over to greenhouse varieties, and they switched to Big Dino, and they found they didn't necessarily have more market to sell tomatoes to, but they found they could cut their labor in half. They only needed to plant half as many tomato plants, so that cut down their pruning, it cut down their seeding, it cut down their lower and leaning, it cut down their harvest time, it cut down on disease pressure because they had less plant matter in their structure. And so for them, that was the win, was they didn't need more fruit per plant. For them, the right answer was less plants in their structure. And now, hey, that freed up some spots for lettuce or cukes or what have you. And that was a win for that grower. One of the things I really like about the book, Andrew, is the concepts, and you break down difficult to understand concepts in a way that helps people understand and also points them in the right direction. And earlier in this discussion, we talked about, those 8 crops. And I know flower growing is is becoming more and more popular and diversifying on your farm, and practices for overwintering flowers in a hoop house are pretty similar to overwintering other crops. What I love about the book is, while you recommend those specific crops as a great place to start, the concepts in the book still apply to anything. You're still talking about average temp in the structure and maybe what a grower should lean on. You talk about fertility. You talk about light transmission and diffusion of light, and that's applicable to that radish and those sweet pea flowers that you might overwinter. And so even if a grower isn't interested in those particular crops, I still think this is a super valuable resource because of all the other information that helps growers be successful when growing in a structure, regardless of what the crop is.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, one thing that I would love is if someone would write a book like that about flowers. And that would be so helpful because, my background as a veggie grower, it's a pretty veggie focused book. But if people are growing a mix of veggies and flowers, a lot of the techniques in the book do apply to flowers and veggies. So we're talking about like airflow, for example. That's one thing that you're doing, whether you're cramming more plants in there, whether it be the 8 vegetables that we're talking about or flowers. More plant matter is going to interrupt airflow more. You're going to tend to have more disease pressure. And I'll say that in the flower world, there can actually be a certain advantage to really, really tightening up the spacing on crops because you get longer stem length. And so, as long as you can keep the plants healthy, some growers can get, I'm just going to back up and say, for people who aren't flower growers or maybe just getting into it, there are some, growers like really long stems because you can make more different types of arrangements. Like there's only certain types of arrangements and bouquets and things you can make with short stemmed crops. And so there are some varieties that are borderline long enough stems that if you cram them in, you're basically doing what we call making the plants leggy, right? Plants reach for light when they sense the competition from plants around them. And so there's some varieties that are borderline long enough that I know growers can get a long enough stem length by growing them in a greenhouse and cramming them really close together because they basically get leggy, but in a good way because the stems get longer. And another factor is the plastic. Growers likely have plastic, maybe glass, but in most cases, smaller growers have plastic. There is a slightly lower light transmission under any kind of covering. And so that will also help to stretch stems out a little bit. But another thing about plastic is that it also diffuses light a little bit. And plants really like that because it makes the light a little bit less harsh. So it's not just it's not really a bad thing that the plastic covering interrupts a little bit of the light. I mean, that's where if if your plastic gets really old, so maybe people haven't seen it, but what happens when greenhouse plastic gets really old, it starts getting kind of milky and starts to interrupt the light transmission. And there's this kind of rule of thumb in greenhouse growing of 1% light transmission equals 1% yield. And so that's when, like, growers will notice if they let their plastic get really old, like we have sometimes on our farm, and then you go and replace the plastic and all of a sudden you have new clear plastic, you will notice the plants grow much better under the newer plastic. But the diffusion is a nice thing. And a lot of the other things that apply to vegetables also apply to flowers, because one of the ways that we counteract cramming all these plants in there is good ventilation, right? So you want to make sure and have roll up sides. Ideally, you have some kind of peak vents on your greenhouse. You should put fans in your greenhouse, and the specific kind of fan I'm talking about is a horizontal airflow fan, which greenhouse growers call half fans. It's just an acronym for horizontal airflow. They're not expensive. They're the things that you'll see hanging from the trusses in a greenhouse. It's a lot like a oscillating fan that you would have in your house. It just has a stem on it. You anchor it to the trusses in a greenhouse, and so that's a way that you can counteract having really high plant densities by making sure there's good airflow. And on the vining fruiting crop side of things, there's pruning and trellising, and that's like that. Pruning and trellising is such a long subject. It's probably too much to tackle right here, but we can just say that one of the reasons that people prune and trellis is because when you take off all the suckers that tend to grow from all of the vining fruiting crops, not only does it help the plant to focus more on the fruit that is set on the plant and ripen that fruit regularly, but also it helps airflow to take all those suckers off. And another kind of pruning that we emphasize in a greenhouse is pruning from the bottom up. And so typically what we say is once you see tomatoes starting to develop, like when they're at kind of like that marble size, really any of these vining crops, when you see the fruit to start forming down at the bottom of the plant, you take off all the leaves below the developing fruit, and you just maintain. That's like a pruning schedule. Is every time you pick out, say you pick the last tomato in a cluster of tomatoes, the next time you give that plant some pruning attention, take off the 3 leaves, because tomato plants tend to put 3 leaves between each cluster, and so what you want to do is take all the leaves off below the developing cluster of fruit, because that's where disease tends to form. Like growers will notice disease tends to form at the bottom of the plant and climb up. And also those older leaves, the plant is also, they're not, by the time that fruit has been picked, they're not getting hit by very much light. They go through a period of senescence anyway, where the plant just stops caring for them because they're not that useful anymore, and eventually they drop off. But the problem is, if you let that process of senescence take place on its own, they're probably covered in disease by the time that they're dropping off. And so that's why, like most big greenhouses you go into, they won't have any leaves below the developing fruit, because that's where the disease tends to develop. And it actually, your fruit will ripen a little bit faster, because warmer fruit ripens faster. And so when your fruit is surrounded by leaves, it makes a microclimate that's a little bit cooler and also a little bit more moist. That's why the disease tends to happen down there at the bottom. So once you get those bottom leaves off, it'll let the next cluster of fruit that's going to develop, it'll actually ripen a little faster because it'll be a little warmer and drier. That airflow aspect, though, it's not the pruning. We don't have the pruning aspect so much with the flowers, but just the roll-up sides, any kind of peak vents or any kind of ventilation you can do, and then moving airflow in the greenhouse. Because typically on like a long skinny tunnel, you'll have 2 sets of fans. You'll have fans on, let's say, the right side of the greenhouse that are pointed down the greenhouse, and then you'll have fans on the left side of the greenhouse pointed up the greenhouse. And so it creates kind of like a big swirl effect. And you should just run those fans 24/7 when there's a crop in there, and just keep the air moving all the time. You'll notice so much less disease pressure than not having fans in there. And so that just kind of supports, it's sort of like our goal is to cram as many plants as possible into that hoop house. And there are these other practices like good ventilation, like running fans, that support having higher densities than we would in the field.
We get a lot of calls while we're talking about controlling the environment, where they'll call up and they want a heater, or they call up and they want double layer because it's more insulation. And my first question always tends to be, okay, great. What type of market do you have in the wintertime? Because so many growers sell at the farmer's market only, and then so many of those don't have a winter market. And so when you pose the question like that, it's like, oh, do I even grow in the winter, or do I even need to? And I think there's instances where you can either cover crop or furlough the house altogether and not spend the money to heat, not spend the labor to go in and out of this thing, maybe build up the soil. So can you talk a little bit about, for some people, this may not be for season growing, but there's still some type of activity, whether that's building up the soil, saving money, or growing, but maybe looking for an alternative market.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, is that people do need to think about their markets, because if their market does shut down over the wintertime, their money would probably be better spent heating a propagation house, right? Because one other technique that's common in the greenhouse industry is growing a seedling that's much larger than in the field, because it's so much cheaper to heat a small propagation space in cells that are really close together, rather than, as soon as you plant them out, you're heating a much larger area. And so greenhouse growers will tend to grow a larger plant that is ready to just take off as soon as it goes in the ground. It's much more economical to heat that propagation house. So yeah, I would say that if growers don't have a winter market, maybe get a smaller heater for a propagation house. Get the plants really big before they even go in, and they could think about cover cropping that hoop house. Yeah, that's a good idea. If the plastic needs to be replaced and it's a place where they have winter precipitation, it's not a bad idea to actually leave the plastic off over the winter, because in an environment where there's no rain, imbalances can build up really quickly. And I mean, that's actually a really good point, is that whether you have imbalances in the fertility that you're applying, or even imbalances in water, because I know a lot of places have, either, if you have hard water, that just means there's a lot of minerals in your water. And so if you think about it, rain has the effect of flushing any nutrients, anything that's in the soil, kind of like diluting it and flushing it farther down in the soil profile. So if all you're doing is drip irrigation, all of that fertilizer stays up towards the top of it. And so if you have hard water, whatever minerals is in your water can actually build up to being too much. If you have really acidic or really basic water, that can actually make a difference over time, because if there's no balancing effect of the rain, people can get in this situation where all of a sudden their soil will be really acidic or really basic, and it's like, did you do a water test? I mean, it's not something that a lot of people think of, is to get their water tested.
And so basic water would be like pumpkin spice flavored.
But it can lead to imbalances, and even just getting a soil test is important. I can't tell you how many times people, had growing problems and it was like, well, what should I do? And I'm like, well, what is your soil test? And they're like, I don't know. I don't have
5 years ago, it may have been one thing, but it builds up, to your point.
Well, exactly. Yeah. If you have really acidic or really basic water and you're watering every single day for 5 years, it may not be common sense, but yeah, if you have really acidic water and you're putting that water on every day for 5 years and no rain to flush it out, it can trend the soil really acidic or basic, whatever your water is. There's other imbalances that are really easy to build up, like calcium, for example. Particularly a lot of tomato growers put on extra calcium, because calcium deficiency is what causes blossom end rot. And so it's not a terrible idea. I mean, there's so many reasons blossom end rot can happen. We could do a whole podcast about blossom end rot, but it's a good idea. I mean, it's a sound idea to make sure that calcium's there in the first place. Calcium is also hard to transport around in the plant, and that's why I say it's complex, because there's also instances where you could have enough calcium, still have blossom end rot because it's not mobile in the plant. But it's got to be there in the first place to not get it. So that's one thing we see sometimes, is growers get really high levels of calcium. It seems like a good problem to have, right? It's like, have a lot of calcium. But most nutrients, and not just calcium, but most nutrients, if they're overabundant, they actually lock up other nutrients. And so too much calcium will lock up other nutrients. Another thing we see a lot is too much phosphorus, okay? Because growers who use exclusively compost or just use a lot of compost will tend to get overabundance of phosphorus, because most compost that people make, even if it's really good compost, has more phosphorus than plants need. And so once again, if you're applying compost every year for 5 years, it's easy to develop a phosphorus imbalance that'll lock up other minerals. And so, I mean, one way you can deal with that is if your phosphorus levels are getting too high, you could say only apply compost to the level that meets your need of phosphorus. And if you still need nitrogen, potassium, or other micronutrients, apply more like single element formulations, or something that doesn't have to be single element, but just something that doesn't have phosphorus in it. Because if your phosphorus levels get really high, then that's going to lock up other minerals, which is why it's a good thing. It's a good thing, if you can, meaning like if you don't have too many electrical components or things in your greenhouse, if it's time to replace the plastic anyway, it's a great idea to leave the plastic off for one winter in places where they get winter precipitation. Just let it rain or snow in there. That will wash some of those imbalances farther down in the soil profile and kind of even some things out. And so that's why even if you can't do that, if you don't have a market all winter long, cover cropping or even just resting it can be good, because one of the things that leads to increased pest and disease pressure is having crops in your greenhouse all the time, right? I think IPM people call it having a green bridge, meaning like take your pest or disease. So like let's say aphids. Aphids are really common on all kinds of plants, but aphids need something to feed on, right? And so one way to break the cycle of aphids or most pests or diseases is just to clean your hoop house out. People shouldn't feel like they have to be growing them all year long, and so one of the reasons sometimes people will have early season problems with aphids is because the aphids overwintered. It's like, let's say you had an overwintering greens crop, and sometimes people, as they're harvesting out rows, they're planting other rows. Like let's say as you're harvesting out rows of winter spinach or something, you're putting in, your spring tomatoes or something like that. Well, sometimes you'll have aphids go from that spinach crop to over to that tomato crop. So it's really ideal. You can break the green bridge in the summer or the winter. So in the wintertime, it's great to clean the greenhouse out for a week or two or whatever time you can manage. Let it freeze or get as cold as it gets in your temperature or in your region, and then hopefully the combination of having nothing to eat for the pests and being too cold for them will kill all or most of them. And same thing in the summertime. Like I realize, in the north, I'm up in Maine. In the north, we make the most of the summer, but I realize in some parts of the deep south, they're almost counter-cyclical, because it gets so hot in the summertime. Even field crops don't grow great in some places, depending on how far south you can get. So you can do the same thing. You can take out all the crops from your greenhouse and either close it up and make it really hot, and that could almost get too hot in some circumstances. But so I would say some places in the deep south, I'm just thinking, like, you guys might know more about that than I do, actually. Like, really high heat may degrade some plastic components and things like that. But like if you're in the deep south and you're really getting that hot in the summertime, it's probably enough to just take all the crops out, even roll up your sides and just let everything bake. And so even without the greenhouse closed up, combination of having nothing to eat and being really hot may kill off a lot of your pests and diseases and give you a cleaner start whenever you go back into the season. So yeah, people, as much as we say it's the most precious real estate, people need to get the most out of it. People shouldn't feel like they have to actually grow 12 months of the year to get a sufficient amount out of their structures.
Talks like this, I'm thinking about, this is exactly what I wanted from the second Market Gardening channel, in that we could dive deeper into some things that make farmers level up. But what I don't want to have happen is somebody listen to this and think, oh, I have to know all this stuff to get started. You learn this over an entire career. And even after you spend a career, you still went to other hoop houses to learn more as you're researching the book. So I don't want people to listen to this and get discouraged that, oh, I have to know all this right away. There's a lot of answers in this book, but what you're not going to get in this book is the practical knowledge of actually going out there and starting and falling on your face a few times. I mean, Carl, I've seen you grow in multiple ways over the years. You've always taken learning opportunities to implement better systems, to reach out to somebody else to say, like, what could I have done? And you've always that's why I think you've grown so far so fast, is because you've not let it kick you in the ribs. You've just taken it and learned up. But the number one problem I see with farmers starting out is the inability or the lack of actually starting or trying something. So, I mean, just say something to that. Like there's, speak, but say, if you're trying to encourage somebody to like, look, the mistakes in this book that you cover, they're still going to get made to some degree. Now, hopefully they're a little less if they read it and apply it and maybe talk to some other folks as they need more research, but there sure isn't a valuable lesson in the doing along with learning as you go.
That's all true. I think it's to be expected that, farming is like anything else, that nothing's going to go perfectly, especially when you take into account unpredictability of the weather, pests and diseases and all those kinds of things. But on the other hand, it's not rocket surgery, Is like I think if you the stuff in the book, you can go very quickly from novice to, I would say, at least an intermediate level, right? Because most of the stuff we've already talked about is not super complicated. At the same time, like that's what I meant about, most of the farms that I worked on, obviously I was working for other people who had established farms, and they, in most cases, weren't doing most of these things, right? So it's one of those things that you can keep doing just the way that you've been taught or been learned until you get onto something else. And so I think greenhouse growing is the kind of thing you can have a very steep learning curve if you just know what to do.
Well, I think something about like lower and leaning. Like I can sit here and tell you how to lower and lean all day, and you can watch the videos that we've done about lower and leaning, but until you go and actually do it, think about your own lowering and leaning. I mean, the first time you do, you feel like an idiot because you're like, why is this so hard? And then after a few sessions of doing it, I mean, you can't hardly see you're going so fast.
Yeah. I mean, so many of the ideas in the book are so simple. In fact, there's one good thing that applies to both vegetables and flowers, and it's also how we first met, Nick. I want to tell people about. So
cue the sappy music.
Yeah. So tell me if I'm wrong, but I think the way we met, right, is that I was working at Johnny's, and so I'll back up a little bit. In addition to doing the trialing at Johnny's, it was also my job to just sort of like help people troubleshoot their problems. Okay. Right. So basically, if people called up and we're talking to the call center, and the call center is pretty knowledgeable. This is a pretty common thing up there in Maine, because we have a short season. A lot of commercial growers will go work the phone lines basically for Johnny's in the winter, and that's how I spent my first winter working for Johnny's. We were starting our farm, and so I did incoming sales, like, hello, thank you for calling Johnny's. What can I help you with? The idea being that I mean, and it works out great because we have a short season, and so farmers who need winter employment can go work there, and it's great for Johnny's also. I don't want this whole podcast to sound like a Johnny's commercial,
Sure.
but like this is like up in this short season area, a lot of commercial growers go work for Johnny's. It works out for Johnny's too, because then they have people on the line. Like that was the whole point why they put me, like they kind of segment the phone lines at Johnny's, like probably a lot of places do, but this is my experience. And so,
well, to be fair, I never called the phone line. I always called Randy.
Yeah.
He was silly enough to give me his cell phone number at one point and was wearing him out.
Well, like Randy said, I mean, that's a really good point, is that the people at your seed company, the people at Bootstrap Farmer, these people are here to help you. And so take advantage of it. If you're out there listening to this, call these people, because these companies, if they're smart,
we can't help you unless we know what issues you're facing.
Well, yeah, and you have people, I mean, like Randy, like Nick, who know what you're doing, and so people should get in touch. The whole idea is on the commercial, the incoming sales line, they hired a lot of commercial growers to work that line, so that people needed help, say, planning out their fields, or wanted feedback on a variety. Hopefully the person could say like, oh yeah, I've grown that variety, or at least I'm familiar with it. And so what would happen is if people called the incoming sales line and they couldn't answer the question, then they would, if it were like a greenhouse tomato question, they would pass them on to me. which honestly is how a lot of this book came about. Because what I noticed after a while is I kept getting the same questions over and over. Yeah. I mean, I had the thought a few times. I was like, somebody should write this stuff down. Somebody should write a book. Like, I had that thought more than once before I actually started writing this book. But so the way Nick and I met, you were having splitting problems.
That's right.
Right. So you had a farm is here in Paris, Texas, right?
Yep. And my son, we only grew sun golds at that time, and it was constant splitting.
Yeah. Okay. So that, I mean, I'm glad you reminded me of that, because sun gold, as anybody who's ever grown sun
Pretty thin
gold,
skin.
yeah, it is very prone to splitting. And, you know, we were talking earlier about how I think thin skins are one of the things that people like about, say, the heirlooms is probably something that's nice, because even though I don't know if they actually taste them, but it detracts from the flavor when a tomato has a really thick
For what
skin.
I was doing with them, like the only thing I could really deal with was a cherry tomato for the salads. I didn't want to mess with slicers or anything like that. And to have such a flavorful tomato that people universally loved across the board, that was equally good in a spicy, a sweet, or a general salad. That was the go-to. And so to set you up a little better, I mean, I had the splitting problem for months, and you know, in a matter of talking to you for 15 minutes, I mean, granted we were in person and everything like that, but had I been on the phone, I could have made the changes you had me made, which was simple. And I'll give everybody the best advice that was ever given in regards to tomatoes. It was an immediate change within the week after it happened.
Yeah. That was so satisfying. It's so satisfying to actually like identify a problem and then have it work out.
Yeah.
So if I remember correctly what was going on, you know, I remember we talked and it kind of like went down asked you some questions and went down almost like a mental checklist of what could be going on, you know, in a very split prone variety. And then I think I asked you what your watering schedule was.
That was it. That was the key.
Yeah. And so I don't remember how often you were watering, but
way too much.
You were watering 24 hours a day, right? You were just on like, yeah. Okay. So the relevant point here, the rule of thumb that I always give growers is not to water.
And before people go, why the hell was he watering 24 hours a day? It was in a Dutch bucket system, and I was recirculating the water. It wasn't like I was just pouring water on soil and having a muddy mess. It was going through. So,
well, it doesn't matter. I mean, pulse irrigation.
I didn't want people to think I was watering soil 24 hours a day.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't that dumb.
Okay, so yeah, but yeah. I mean, I guess that's a good point. You know, pulse irrigation is a great idea, but one of the, and I'll get to pulse irrigation in just a second, but another really good rule of thumb for flowers or vegetables is not to water within, say, 2 hours of sunrise or sunset. Right. Because the idea is you only want to put water on the plants, and I'm talking drip irrigation here, or you only want to give plants water when they're actually active and taking that water up. Because so there is a special use of this rule with tomatoes, and it's splitting. Because when tomatoes are overwatered, they'll try to take on extra water and bank it in the fruits. What happens is the fruits, they expand. Because what happens, I don't know if people know this, but when tomatoes are green, the skins are elastic. And as they approach ripeness, when you see the skins the tomatoes start to change color, the skin is losing its elasticity. Because if you think about it, you know, the skin has to be elastic for a good long time, right? You know, if a tomato starts out, you know, smaller than the tip of your pinky, and then it gets, you know, can grow to be a big beefsteak, it's got to have some. It's got to be like a balloon in some respect, in that, you know, it's got to expand, but it only goes so far, right? And so typically around the time that you see some color forming on tomatoes, that skin is losing elasticity.
I remember you explained it to me in that a tomato plant's job is not to make tomatoes, it's to live. And as the tomato gets stressed out, it forms the fruit to act as a reserve for water that it doesn't think it's going to get. So stressing the plant out a little bit was the good idea. And to your point, as the skin starts to develop and it becomes ripe, that's where we always got the splitting. And so the other thing I wanted to mention is you can't even imagine how many times I've passed along that information to new growers that have come onto the bootstrap. The notion of 2 hours after sunset, 2 hours before sunset, if it's super hot or we're a southern grower, a little bit right smack in the middle of the day. I have repeated that hundreds of times since that conversation that we've had. And that one little timeout that we had for 15 minutes 10 years ago, against all odds that we met, has been passed down in numerous times. And it's the thing I like the most about stuff like this is seasoned people getting help, people that need a little hand down to pull everybody back up. I love it.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a really important principle. And like, I don't know if people want to know the exceptions to the rule, like occasionally in a really dry climate, like, parts of like Arizona maybe, or, parts where they don't have rain for a really long time and it's really dry. Sometimes people may do a little bit of irrigation in the night or something, but it's a rule of thumb. People can pretty much stick by that. It's not just don't irrigate in the night and don't irrigate within an hour or two. And like I said, it'll help with flowers too. It'll help with any crop because root diseases tend to occur when there's standing water, when the roots are waterlogged. Partially because a lot of the root zone pathogens thrive in waterlogged conditions, and also because if the roots are waterlogged, roots need some air. Like people may not realize all parts of the plant respire and need air. And so that's why it's great to put some water on and then let the plant take it up, let it soak into the soil, and that draws some air into the soil also. And so you want these cycles, because if you get, field growers will notice it's after prolonged periods of rain, or like if field growers have a low spot in the field, that's where root diseases will start. They'll start in that low spot that's waterlogged. And so by, even in flowers or any crop really, you can have less root diseases both by not watering in the night, by doing pulse irrigation, meaning I guess it's not a very fancy term, but it's a slightly fancy term for just spacing out your irrigation. So my example would be if you know your crop needs an hour of water, like it's pretty typical. Like at least for me in the summertime, like I'll put about an hour of water a day on, say, a tomato crop or most of the things that we're growing in a hoop house. But if you can break that, even just a cheap irrigation timer that'll break it up into 4 15-minute waterings throughout the day instead of one concentrated hour, that will also, in addition to helping the tomatoes not split, in other crops, you'll have less root diseases, because instead of putting a whole lot of water on and kind of suffocating the roots for a little while, you'll space that water out, and those little pulses of irrigation will just lead to a healthier roots than putting all the water on at once.
There's another significant point in the book that Randy stumbled across that we talked about yesterday before we picked you up, and that was noticing how different light in different fabrics inside of the hoop house can affect. And we have, I think our number one question about shade cloth is, do I need white? Do I need black? Should I get the aluminum? And I'd like for you to cover that a little bit if you can. But Randy, I like the way you set that up. And you kind of mentioned it earlier, but Randy's ability to take a complex subject and within the book and over a couple of paragraphs, answer this question. So if you can kind of set him up with our conversation.
A great example, right, is in the book you talk about landscape fabric, and you talk about the difference between white and black, and when it may also be appropriate to use white on black, right? Black side down, white up. And, I've been selling hoop houses. I always recommend landscape fabric for various reasons, mainly to help control heat too, and that white color reflecting some of that heat. A concept that never even occurred to me is that you mentioned in the book is also that it's reflecting light, right? And so you're by default giving the plant more light and more light to the underside of leaves. So it's an example, I think, in the book where you're mentioning some concepts and digesting it in an easy way for someone to understand. And I don't care how long you've been farming, how familiar you are with growing in a hoop house, there is something in this book that you're going to get your money's worth by buying the book. For me, I learned more about that reflection on the landscape fabric. You did a better job explaining diffusion of light coming through plastic than you helped me understand concepts of it and I typically explain it to other people, right? So it's there's tons of things here, but maybe you can just a couple bullet points about shade, or a couple bullet points about landscape fabric, and maybe the white versus the black, and the point about white on black.
Yeah, I'll take the landscape fabric. You might be able to actually address the whole shade cloth thing better than I would. But I mean, I think what you're getting at, Randy, is that one of the things that I talk about in the book is I think people are so used to using black landscape fabric or black plastic out in a field situation. This is one of those things that people carry over from field application in a greenhouse application that may not be to their advantage, right? So field growers often use either black plastic or black landscape fabric to both block weeds, but also warm up the soil, so crops grow faster early in the spring. And so I've seen a lot of people do that in greenhouses, and it's not as effective in greenhouses for two reasons. And so one reason is because greenhouse, you're relying on the structure to change the climate, right? Mm-hmm. You put all this work into building the greenhouse. Once you get very far into the season, the challenge actually becomes keeping it too cool. Mm-hmm. Probably even worse down here in Texas, I'm sure. Which is where, maybe you want to talk about shade cloth here in a minute. But even in Maine, I mean, I want to say by May, our job during the day becomes keeping the house cool enough, because so much, the greenhouse effect is working so well. We're starting to get temperatures, I want to say, in the high 80s and 90s, even by May, which is, not very far into the season. And so one thing that will help moderate those temperatures, of course, is white ground covering. Because it's going to reflect that light, of course, instead of absorbing it, which is what you want out in the field. But in the greenhouse, let the structure do the temperature modulation, and having a white ground cover will help you keep the structure that much cooler during the day. And then the double duty of that white ground covering is what Randy just said. Is of course it's not heating up as much because it's reflecting so much more light than a dark ground covering. But what I didn't know is that leaves can absorb solar radiation even when it's hitting them on the bottom side of the leaf, and so there's some number, they've quantified it, like a bright ground covering bounces some percent of a high percentage of the solar radiation that hits the greenhouse floor bounces back up into the plant canopy. And instead of going to work overheating your greenhouse, it can go to work growing your plants. So your plants actually get a little bit more solar radiation if you're bouncing it up in there with a light colored ground covering. And it is important. I'm glad you mentioned that about using black on white plastic, because if there are just white plastic ground coverings out there, but the thing about white plastic ground coverings is that the light transmits through that plastic. And so if you're irrigating under that plastic and the light's going through and it's nice and warm, weed seeds can germinate like crazy. And some of those weeds are so tough. Yep. It's almost like they're in their own little mini greenhouse down there, and the weeds will grow up under the plastic. And it's more that it makes a mess, because they can actually push the plastic up, and and they can grow out, through the holes in your landscape fabric or whatever openings you have, they'll grow out from under and be a real pain that you didn't bargain for. So it is important if you're going to put white landscape fabric down, like what we use the white on black plastic. You guys probably know there may be other options, but just make sure you don't use just like a white plastic film or like white landscape fabric, because you will get weed growth under the fabric.
And it makes sense, to think about how this applies in our real life. Of like, would white reflect? I mean, go outside when there's snow on the ground and when the sun's beating off it, right? And it all but blinds you. And it makes perfect sense that white covering is reflecting some of that light, right? So, talking about shade, typically Bootstrap sells shade in 30% and 50%. And we can special order other percents as well. But our kind of rule of thumb is anybody in the north of the Mason-Dixon line, we're going to go with a 30% shade. Anybody south of the Mason-Dixon line, we're doing 50%. And part of that is, as you mentioned, every percent of light transmission you're blocking, you may be robbing some yield but that extra blocking is helping to control that heat, in Texas versus, hey, in Maine, I might just be trying to, I'm at 85 and I'd like it to be 80. I don't necessarily need that 50%. That 30% is going to work great for us. We find, the white and the aluminate or aluminum type shade tends to diffuse light. So you do a good job talking about the practice of light diffusion and what that means for a plant, right? If you can break some of that light down into smaller usable portions for that plant, you can absorb it better and convert that to energy. And those whites and that aluminum type shade helps diffuse some of that light and break it down to a point where it's a little bit more, it's easier for the plant to uptake it. So that's kind of the difference between the black, the white, the silver, in that regards. But going back to the book, we get those popular questions you get. Should I get a Quonset style, a round style, or a Gothic? You talk about it. Help demystify shade, and landscape fabric. You talk about it. And those are pretty basic entry. I'm ready to build my hoop house today or buy one today. You knock that out. What crops? You knock that out. And then even for someone, Carl going to his third, fourth, fifth season, whatever it is, he might be beyond that, but he's finally ready to start tackling grafting tomatoes. And the book is still valuable at that point in walking through, do I want to steer my plant into a generative, or vegetative type state. So it's kind of soup to nuts. I think anybody growing in that hoop house or greenhouse would need.
I mean, a lot of the ideas are pretty accessible. I mean, another thing I think is worth touching on is fertility for greenhouses and hoop houses, because when you think about, you're probably growing in a longer season. Like, all right, let's start from field. Like, let's say you know how to grow a great head of lettuce out in the field. You know how to grow a great tomato out in the field. So now you're going to stretch, whatever your field season is, you're going to start a little earlier and go a little longer, right? So your plant needs more fuel, right? And so you can't just take whatever amount of fertility you're putting on out in the field and put it in the greenhouse, because that's one thing I see a lot, is that at the end of the season, greenhouse tomatoes are getting really thin up top. They're not really pushing any more fruit. They just run out of gas. Somebody put fertilizer on at the beginning of the season and didn't put any more on. But it's also not enough to just say like double. It can't be like, well, I'm growing 3 months out in the field and I'm going to go 6 months in a greenhouse. So I'm just going to double the amount of fertilizer and put it on all at the beginning of the season. Because kind of like we were talking about earlier with nutrient imbalances with too much calcium or too much phosphorus, if you put twice the amount of nitrogen in particular, right? Because nitrogen tends to make plants grow too fast and too vegetatively, right? And so if you put twice the amount of nitrogen that you put on a plant out in the field on your greenhouse, that plant is going to grow so fast, the leaves are going to be huge, it's going to look awesome. But when a plant is too vegetative, the fruit tend to ripen very slowly. The fruit can actually be too small, because what it means is the plant is putting tons of energy into the leaves at the expense of putting energy into the fruit. I can't give an exact specific recommendation of like how much fertilizer, because that depends on, the crop, how much fertilizer is in the soil already. But what I can say is that people should put maybe half of the fertility they need for the whole season on up front. And that's where people need to either start side dressing or fertigating. And so fertigating is just a fancy word for applying fertilizer through the water. And also, just like we were talking about with the phosphorus or the calcium, if you put twice of everything at the beginning of the season, you would lock up certain nutrients. There would be too much of some things that make other nutrients unavailable. And so that's where, if people want to apply solid fertilizer, they can just come back through. They can put maybe half the fertilizer on at planting time, and then come back through and add, and side dress, just like you would side dress a crop out in the field, just side dress. You can either drop fertilizer at the base of the plant. If you have landscape fabric all the way up to the stems, you can even, I know some growers even pull the landscape fabric back, put fertilizer down. Honestly, that's a pain in the butt. The other, I prefer fertigating because you don't have to deal with any kind of covering, pulling it back or anything like that. And the other difficulty in a hoop house where it's not raining, the fertilizer can sit on the soil surface because it's not getting wet, and it's not, you kind of almost have to work it into the soil with a hoe or something to get the fertilizer active at the base of the plant, which is also a pain. So, I mean, if somebody asked me, I would think about fertigation. There's some pretty simple fertilizer injectors that are basically almost like a fancy bucket that will draw. You can put them in line with your irrigation system. It doesn't have to be a complicated or expensive system. And a strong fertilizer mixture in the container, and it siphons it. So when your irrigation comes on, it gradually pulls and almost meters the liquid fertilizer into your irrigation stream. So as it's mixing with your irrigation water, it dilutes it down to a suitable percentage. There's stuff like a dosatron is like something that's not super expensive, but it's a little fancier than some of the fertilizer injectors. I mean, there's a lot. Like if you look up fertilizer injectors, I don't know if you guys sell them, but there's a lot of different ways to get liquid fertilizer into your irrigation system that aren't super complicated. And so that's just the principle is just longer season, you're going to need more fertility. I mean, if you're doing quick cycles of greens crops, if you're doing a crop of lettuce that you're rotating out every month, it's not so important. You can just like work new fertilizer in between short crops like that. But those really long season crops like any of the vining fruiting crops, tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, or eggplant, do need some extra fertilizer added throughout the season. Yeah.
Have you ever noticed, or can you speak to how fertilizers, the pH balance? So like I just got all my soil results back, and I'm high. I'm like at around an 8 right now, which I kind of expected because I've been putting a lot of compost on. And I'm wondering though, because we do fertigation, but like also I'm like, I wonder, like, is this like jacking with my? How do you stay on top of like your pH balance? Because I'm seeing some side effects now. Now I'm starting to realize I'm at an imbalance, which is why I got my soil tested. But then I started thinking like, how much am I messing around with my pH by the fertilizer? And also second point on that, because you said maybe twice a year you would do your do 2 feedings. But if you're fertigating, like we were doing that in the peak, at least maybe a month after fruiting, 2 months after fruiting, we're applying it every 2 to 3 weeks fertigation.
Yeah.
On that. So is that accurate too? Would you say if you're fertigating, you have to do that a lot more? Whereas if you're putting pellets down, right? Those are long withstanding. You're spoon feeding with fertigation versus the time consuming slow process of dissolving of the pellets or whatever you're using for your fertilizer.
Yeah. Well, that's why, I mean, my preference really is fertigation, and from experience, I've side dressed in my greenhouse and then come back and found it moldy, because it's,
me too.
Yeah. And cause it's a hot, humid environment, and it gets kind of like wet, but not really wet enough. And also, the roots may come up to the surface, but they're not like aggressive. I don't think they're really going to come up. I mean, that's why, I don't know. Some people prefer side dressing. So I guess I want to throw it out there. I will say I have because of experiences like that, because of putting down fertilizer and then coming back and finding it moldy, right? Because you think if that mold is there on the fertilizer, it may be making spores that would jump to your plant or whatever. Yeah. So, but to your point about affecting the pH, the fertilizer affecting the pH of your soil. Yeah, definitely. Could be just like we were talking about the irrigation water maybe affecting the pH of your soil. So if it's a fertilizer that you're buying, the company really should probably be able to tell you what the pH of that is. And so I think what you're probably getting at is that most vegetables want to be fairly neutral, slightly on the acidic side. I mean, that's usually different vegetables have slightly different preferences, but most of them want to be neutral but slightly acidic. And so there are things, or like if I don't know if you've had a water tester, your water may be further, throwing things off. So there are things like citric acid is actually something that's OMRI approved. So OMRI, Organic Material Review Institute, I think. So OMRI, citric acid is something, right? I mean, it's a food ingredient. It makes things more acidic. And so, you can add, there's things you can add to your water, citric acid and it's escaping me, but there's also something, if your water's really acidic, there's something else. There are things that are organically approved that can change that. So yeah, I think that would be worthwhile to find out if your fertilizer or your water or both, it can be an additive effect, right? If they're both a little bit acidic, that might be driving your soil. Or I think you said at 8, so it sounds like maybe, I don't know if your soil is getting more basic over time. But yeah, there's things that you can put, if it turns out that your water or your fertilizer or both are making your soil acidic or basic, there's things that you could put. Yeah, I mean, that would be another thing, but you could put it in your fertigation. And so, yeah, I mean, in whatever cycle you want to be on, I mean, most of the experiments on plants have found that smaller additions of fertilizer are more constant. It tends to make plants more happy. I mean, that's almost like a good rule of thumb. It's like plants are living things just like us. We don't want to go from a freezing cold day like into a really hot room. We don't want to get really hungry and then eat a whole lot. It's like all the extremes. Same thing with plants. And so I think it's the kind of thing, like I think every 2 or 3 weeks is great. You could also just make it a weekly part of your routine. Put a week or make a weekly application of fertigation.
Right.
Just less than you're doing every 2 3
and
weeks.
mixing it up too. I mean, right, it doesn't have to be the same ingredients every week. So I know sometimes we'll do like an Epsom salt, and so when we're watering, we'll add a little magnesium, through that, and that's our fertigation that week. And next week, then we'll go back to our regimen. Then we'll, like in the hot summer where plants are just dying here, that's when I start to go back. I said, I'm begging you to go back to some vegetation growth, so I'll feed it a whole bunch of nitrogen through the fertigation process. And I mean, a lot of it for me though is that's just thumb in the air. I'm like, like I can't find an exact context for my setting here, and so a lot of it is trial and error. And books obviously are great too, but there's going to be so much variance from what you're doing if you're in a Dutch bucket or hydro or what we're doing. So but
I think the important part here though too is, yes, it's trial and error, but these are perfect things to add to your notes on your season and reflect back on next year, or say, geez, I did have that problem last year. What steered me out of it? And maybe the situation is slightly different, but oftentimes it is the same, and your own farm notes are going to be your best asset.
Well, this has been great. I obviously can't recommend the book enough. Randy, I really liked what you said. It's great for beginners. It's also great for people years into it. Obviously, the research is there, and that's what I like so much about it. Is it's knowledge that wasn't just, hey, this is my experience and I'm gonna write on it. You took the time to go to other places. You've been to a lot of farms. You've apprenticeships at a lot of farms, and I think you brought more than a career's worth of knowledge into one single source that people have so many questions about. So I'm going to ask one final question, and then we'll tag this one out. But on the phone, there's so much that scares people about hoop houses. Whether a lot of it is what's the snow load, how much does it cost, how long is it X, Y, or Z going to last. So what scares people about hoop houses that probably shouldn't, and vice versa? What do people never ask or think about that they probably should be more concerned about?
Take the leap, especially if you already have some growing experience. It transfers, and so that's what I'm trying to do with the book, is to say, like, a lot of 90% of what you already know, if you're already a grower, you can rely on, and it's just making some simple changes, like the stuff that we talked to here. It's not growing on Mars, right? It's like it's taking what you already know and just tweaking it. And generally generally speaking, things grow in hoop houses, but it's also not, it's not magic, right? It's almost like you're trading certain pests, and you tend to trade certain pests and disease of the field for other pests and diseases of the hoop house. And so
it's funny how such a simple, basic structure can cause so much confusion, and then at the same time be such a godsend to so many farmers on multiple levels. And I think 1 or 2 visits to a neighboring hoop house before making that purchase would go miles in easing everybody's mind into it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I remember having a conversation with Annie, my wife, before we built our first hoop house, saying like, well, looks like all the other growers around here who are making money have hoop houses. Like, we probably should do it. So yeah, obviously I'm biased. I love them. I would urge people to take the leap. It's, even if there's some bumps, the learning curve tends to be steep. There's 2 quick points that I can say that I think is going to help people a lot. And one thing is automation. There's starting to be some really good automation. It used to be automation was really expensive, required a lot of hardware and different kinds of things. I would urge people to look into automating some of their systems. They can automate roll-up sides, they can automate heaters, they can automate watering. I mean,
that's just a simple thermostat. I think when people hear automation and think about robots and computer systems and Wi-Fi, a thermostat, a water timer, anything you can do to save yourself a little bit of time or worry or forgetfulness during the day.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. It doesn't even have to hardly be anything electronic. Just like water timer. So that way you can't forget to turn it on. You also can't forget to turn it off. Mm-hmm. Right. And then, we don't have time to cover all of the how-to, but for tomatoes, grafting. That's one thing I did a lot of trials on when I was at Johnny's. Grafting is a huge help to tomatoes. Every single trial I ever did on tomatoes, comparing grafted tomatoes to ungrafted tomatoes, the grafted tomatoes, yield and vigor was always better. That's actually something, the vigor will be higher. That's one thing. Like if you are trying to grow tomatoes through somewhere that has a really hot season like Texas, vigor is something that will help plants overcome stress. Then the other thing is that the rootstocks have disease resistance to just a huge catalog of almost all the soil-borne diseases. I think the farther south you get, the worse they get with verticillium, fusarium. There's all kinds of different fusarium variants and things. So like grafting, it could be we could do a whole podcast on grafting. So I'll just say it's covered in the book. There's a lot of resources out there. Grafting, particularly if you're growing tomatoes, which is worth mentioning, right? I mean, tomatoes, when like all the 8 crops that we covered, tomatoes have an outsized importance, and lettuce too, and probably also microgreens. I mean, farms. I know a lot of kind of depends on what your farm. So those 3 have a certain special importance, but I think it's worth mentioning that grafting is so worthwhile. And I mean, it would be awesome if people could buy grafted plants from somebody, either like order them through the mail, because for a nerd like me, it was fun to learn, but it is kind of a fussy process. And once again, it's not rocket surgery, but it's also
it's a skill.
It's not everybody's cup of tea, and you're going to kill some plants along the way learning. Like I'm going to shut up about grafting, but my best advice is to people to teach themselves by getting either, if they have some old tomato seed that's not germing well or whatever, or just go buy the cheapest
a practice crop.
Exactly. Don't teach yourself how to graft on the crop that you intend to plant. Figure it out. If you figure it out on some expendable plants, and people don't have to do it if they can buy plants, but whether you graft them yourself or buy them, grafting absolutely makes a huge difference in tomato production.
Well, it's not lost on us that you're a family man, you got young kids, you're 1,800 miles from home in the dead of winter when you're probably needed the most. But just like you took that time out for me 10 years ago, you've taken out this whole day to do all this series of podcasts for our listeners. It's highly valuable to everybody, and we sure appreciate it. So, think about that as you're watching and listening to this, the time and effort that goes into this. Just give us a like, give us a subscribe, continue to ask questions. We're going to get down there and answer them below. Check out Growing for Market Magazine, an invaluable resource that really made a big difference for me, and Hoop House Greenhouse Growers Handbook. Got to get it. And thanks for everything and we'll see you. We'll see you soon. I
Yeah,
hope.
thanks so much for having me. I've enjoyed visiting with you guys so much, and obviously I'm a nerd about this, and I'll keep talking to anybody who'll listen. So, so I've really enjoyed it spending time with you guys.
All right, you're the best. Thank you.